Good evening and welcome to Talking Devils, the leading independent Manchester United podcast. I'm Paul and this is episode 3 of the United Before Fergie podcast. If you're watching live on YouTube or Facebook, then please feel free to get your comments or your questions in. If you're watching the replay, hello. But do still feel free to comment as we will reply. If you're listening back on the audio podcast, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on the platform you're listening on. This week, my guests are the two Tonys. We firstly got Tony Davis, who is a lifelong United supporter, who was 15 years old at the time, and he attended this particular match that we're going to discuss tonight, and we're going to get his experiences of the day. And also, welcome to Tony Park. Many of you will know him as Mr. Mujak on Twitter. Author of Sons of United, United historian, collector of memorabilia. Have I covered it all off there, Tony? Have I missed anything out? It's about right. So good evening, chaps. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast. We were just talking before we went live about the topic of today's podcast, which is the 1983 Cup final, as we're quite tightly tied in with Brighton in this topic. So obviously after the excitement of yesterday, of the penalty shootout, which we're not going to talk about because we don't cover that sort of stuff. And it's 41 years ago to the day when Norman Whiteside made his debut as a 16-year-old for United against Brighton at the Goldstone Ground in a 1-0 win, where a winner by Ray Wilkins. And I'm no doubt he'll come up in conversation at some point this evening as well. I also like to talk through or go through some comments that that our social media followers have given us, both on Facebook and on Twitter. And there's been some brilliant stories, and that's really what we're all about. So, good evening, Tony's. How are you both?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm
happy. Good, thank you. No, welcome to the podcast, Tony. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on. And Mr. Mujak, as I want to refer to you now, I think. How are you, sir?
I'm a lot better after yesterday. Although it was one of those games where a lot of United fans, I don't know if you went, Paul, but at the stadium, a lot of people were like, just particularly after Thursday last week, there was a degree, not nervousness, but there was just a funny feeling around the stadium where just to get the result, I think, was really pleasing. So the journey home was a lot better than it could have been.
I bet it was. But, when it got to penalties, you're like, oh, okay, I might as well pack up and go home.
I know, and when he took off Fernandes, we were like, oh my God, he's taken off one of our best, the number one penalty taker. And we were trying to work it out because it looked like dead cert penalties, from about half an hour to go. Yeah. So, but anyway, it all ended well.
Yeah. So let's take it back 40 odd years. So we played Brighton in two completely contrasting games at Wembley in 1983. What I'd like to touch on first, and I know I very briefly sort of mentioned this before we came on, is around the FA Cup. Now, today's the younger generation, correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think have as much appreciation for the FA Cup as us older fellas do. It's kind of watered down now. It's a Saturday tea time kickoff. Whereas back in the day, it was 3 o'clock. It was Saturday afternoon. The build-up was all day long. And I just want to try and give a bit of context around when us older fellas talk about the FA Cup with such glowing terms, why we do the way we do. And I'm sure there's many that will listen that will maybe have the same thoughts and feelings. So I'm going to go to you first, Tony P, Mr. Mujak. The FA Cup, try and describe how the FA Cup was, how it all felt back in, sort of back in the 80s when we were like younger.
Well, I think it was one of those things that started before that, Paul. I think I'm not talking for everybody. I can only talk about myself. Television coverage wasn't like it was now. So as a consequence, you got match of the day once a week, and that was it. That's all you got was match of the day. Mm-hmm. And match of the day often covered, a couple of first division games, a second division game, maybe even a third division game. And so you never even saw all the other teams. So what basically happened was the only game you ever really saw live was the FA Cup final. So, and once again, there was only one team in Europe. The team who won the league got into the European Cup. The team that won the FA Cup got into the Cup Winners' Cup. If you won the League Cup, you didn't get anything. And then if you finished second or third in the league, you got into the UEFA Cup. So there was only, the whole European thing was low key in comparison to what it is today. So as a consequence, what was on TV was incredibly minimal. And I'm talking from a perspective of living in Australia at the time. It could have well been different in England, but I'm not so sure it was that different. Tony and yourself will probably know more, obviously. But, coming from a football family, my father would say, this is the one game of the season. It was the last game of the season. It was the end of the season. The team who had played in the European Cup normally wasn't an English team. The team who won the league, it was over and done with. So this was this huge crescendo of getting to the final. And there was a romance and a history, and any team across the league could have done it. And there was this, and in the 70s, before we get to the 80s, in the 70s, you had Sunderland in 73, you had Fulham in 75, you had Southampton in 76. So, you had this romance of, it wasn't just the top two teams in the league who got there. So therefore, it was really exciting. It was really exciting. Any, football fans from all over the country and all over the world felt that their team could get there. So come to 1983, and it was a reinforcement of that, because obviously Brighton had just got promoted to the first division a couple of seasons previous, which was unheard of in terms of their history. They were, not a renowned club with any form of history at all. And so they were relegated that season. So to get to the FA Cup final, made that romance even bigger. So there was huge drama that wasn't existing in any other form around about that time. And people still had memories of United losing to Southampton in 76. So this and Sunderland winning in 73. So, the underdog had chances. And so that's what created that drama. The money wasn't, as divisive as it is now. So, the Brighton team of that day they had a very good team. And, as other underdog teams did as well, they were very good sides. So anything could happen on a day, and it was cup football. Anything could happen in a cup final. So you always went in with a degree of the final day of the season with that romance, but also the apprehension that there were no certainties. Anything could happen. Form is out the window. All those cliches that you hear about the FA Cup. And it was true. And I think, that's what made it such a special occasion around the world. It was, all of those things drawn together in this penultimate clash that would finish the season in some form of flourish. Either the top team would prevail and be historic, or the underdog would win and the fairy tale would continue for another season. It was great.
Yeah, you make a massive point about the romance of it. I was 11 in 1983, and for me, it was the World Cup and the European Cup all rolled up into one. It was arguably the biggest day of the football season. The league, and I touched on this on a couple of podcasts ago, is the league is what you wanted to win, because that was your bread and butter. But the FA Cup just had something mystical about it. And the way I looked at it as a kid is, if you win the FA Cup, you are the best team in the country, because every semi-pro and amateur team and professional team can take part in the FA Cup competition. Obviously, it's the same now, but it just seemed, me, an 11-year-old kid, is like, the FA Cup, this is the best thing ever. So Tony Davis, what are your recollections and kind of what did the FA Cup mean to you as a 15-year-old walking down Wembley Way, heading to the historic final? Just how do you sum up the FA Cup for anyone who perhaps wasn't born in the 80s, or said, well, it's kind of a Tim Pot trophy now, it's all about the Champions League and the Premier League? It most certainly was not like that.
No. I think I'd take my memories back to the December before, when the second round proper would end, and I think it was on a Monday lunchtime then. The draw for the third round would come in with all the top two division clubs in, and the excitement that generated. And then, you'd slowly, especially as United often were then, if you're having a league season where you weren't really challenging for the title, you'd be excited at that FA Cup tie coming around in the cold weeks of January. And then as you got through the rounds and the ties, and you, I mean, for part of me, especially being 15 and very, shall we say, impressionable, the massive followings away from home. I think we went to Derby and Luton in that FA Cup run with huge and raucous United followings and prevailing as well. And the sort of seasons changing, you know, and getting slowly warmer as you reach that. And I remember the semi-final against Arsenal at Villa Park in a really hot, sunny day. And like you say, it absolutely poured down in at Wembley on the Saturday anyway, on Saturday afternoon. It was just the build-up to that really across the season, especially as often happened, United's league form collapsed a little bit towards the end. It was just the FA Cup, and you know, I remember the excitement because Brighton knocked out Liverpool on that run when they really weren't supposed to. I mean, Liverpool were fairly dominant in those days, weren't they? And I remember the excitement of that giving United a sort of route to that trophy. And these were days where we wouldn't win many trophies. I mean, I was following them. They'd only, from about 72, they'd only won the FA Cup once in 77. And it was that excitement, and just be walking up Wembley Way, fully expectant of victory against a relegated Brighton team, was just amazing. And you mentioned television a short while ago, and I remember thinking, I won't watch any of that this year because I'm actually going, and hoping that the experience of going would replace it, and it did. It dwarfed it really, just to be there amongst tens of thousands of United fans in fairly expectant mood was amazing, really.
Yeah, you're quite correct. And you know, as in my very well, even a teenager then, it was massively exciting, and it almost felt then that the league was secondary. In my sort of 11-year-old head, it was, well, we're not challenging for the league as maybe we would have, and we're a good cup side, 76, 77, 79, 83. And for me, it just felt like the most glamorous trophy to win. You were in the FA Cup final. You made it. It was better than winning the league. It was better than doing this and that. Obviously, as I got older, that has slightly changed. But like you say, we never really pushed Liverpool for the title. But I think the FA Cup it's just always been, and even now in my 51-year-old head, it is still a fantastic trophy that you want to win, and it's one of your goals at the beginning of the season is to get to the FA Cup final, because for me that kind of sums up the whole glamour around the tournament. But we want to talk about the first match. We do want to cover the replay as well. So there's quite a lot to unravel here. So the first game, absolutely threw it down, very much like it is today, and like it was yesterday, which I get them was very ironic. The fact that it absolutely chucked it down yesterday, and United were playing Brighton at Wembley. Tony, Mr. Mewjack, how old were you in 1983? Dare I ask, sir?
I was 20 years old.
You're 20 years old.
Actually, funny enough, 21 years old. I just had my 21st birthday, because my birthday's in early May. So I just had my birthday leading up to the first game.
What do you remember of your experience of that day? I mean, did you have the build up like we did here?
No,
it's just okay.
It doesn't. I mean, it was always one of the things when you live in another country, you miss. And my father used to tell me about the build up, because he was obviously he lived in the UK before immigrating to Australia, so he would often tell me, and my grandfather would tell me, about you'd get up at 11 o'clock and you'd watch from 12 o'clock onwards or 10 o'clock onwards, you'd watch 4 hours of TV, which was really unheard of. And so they would often tell me those kind of anecdotes about the players having breakfast in the hotel and all the interviews, and it was really weird because even with an Australian sport, with those big games, they never had a build up like that. So the Aussie Rules Grand Final, the Rugby League Grand Finals, or whatever, they never had any of that stuff. So it was really unique. And so what would often happen is the TV in Australia was around about 1 o'clock in the morning. So they would kind of go in at 12:30, and you'd get the preamble, and you'd get the last kind of 15-20 minutes of before they'd enter the pitch, and then you'd get obviously the 10 minutes of ceremony where they'd walk onto the pitch and get introduced to the royalty and all that stuff. But the reason I remember it so clearly was, as Tony has just said, in actual fact, by mid-March, we were really challenging top of the table. We were playing really well, and then we lost to Liverpool in the League Cup in March, and that really affected us, I think, because we played so well, and we'd lost that, and that raised a lot of expectations because we had these two great semi-finals with Arsenal, which we played brilliantly in those games. And then we played Arsenal again, as Tony's just mentioned, in the semi-final of the FA Cup. So it was quite unusual to face the same team in both semi-finals of both competitions. So when Brighton had defeated Liverpool, that gave everybody a real lift. Even where I was living, people felt with Liverpool not being there because it affected. I mean, I think we lost. I think we only won 3 games of our last 10 or 11 in the league. And if we'd won, those 7 games we drew or lost, if we'd won them, we would have been still fighting for the league. But it was that kind of, Liverpool had that kind of mentality over you. So when Brighton and United were let out, and the TV was making a lot of noise about Steve Foster, one of the things that I guess you'll know more than me in some respects is most people didn't really know all the Brighton players. So when you looked at that Brighton lineup, the first thing that you noticed was, who in the hell is? I mean, we knew Graham Mosley because he had played for Derby, and he was a player who'd been around for a little while.
And he'd also experienced defeat. And he'd also experienced defeat against United in a semi-final.
Yeah, and we knew Jimmy Case because Jimmy Case had played for Liverpool in '77. But the other players, to be really frank, Chris Ramsey, Gary Stevens, Graham Pearce, Gary Howlett, we didn't know them because we didn't watch Brighton every day of the week. No. And because, as I mentioned earlier, they weren't on TV regularly, you didn't really get to see these players week in. A lot of them were unknowns. So from a United perspective, there was a lot of talk in the media about Steve Foster not playing. But for the average United fan, I don't think that was on our mind. That wasn't a huge thing that was made out by the press. And we were I was anyway, just incredibly confident, having played so well against Liverpool in the League Cup final, and being very unfortunate to lose the game due to what I would call a couple of bad decisions and an injury, where Gordon McQueen had to go up front. He could hardly run. We were very, very confident. And then when you looked across our line and you saw the likes of Robson and Wilkins and Stapleton and Whiteside, who'd had a very good season, and Arnold Muren, of course, had that experience in his first season from Ipswich, I was just really, really confident. And even though we didn't get the build-up, when the teams walked out, it was kind of, I really felt it was like a bunch of unknowns versus a team that I knew and had extreme confidence in. That's what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the two teams and the two lineups. So Brighton had Graham Mosley, Chris Ramsey, Gary Stevens, Steve Gatting, who, if my memory serves me right, is brother of Mike Gatting, the England cricketer. Graham Pearce, Neil Smiley, Tony Grealish was skipper, Jimmy Case we all knew of, Gary Howlett, Mike Robinson and Gordon Smith, who again will no doubt come up in conversation a little bit later. United's team that day were Gary Bailey in goal, He had a back four of Mike Duxbury, Kevin Moran, Gordon McQueen, and Arthur Albiston. You had midfield of Alan Davis. I'd like to talk about him briefly. So Alan Davis, Ray Wilkins, Robbo, Arnold Muren, and up front you had Stapleton and Norman Whiteside, and the substitute that day for the first game was Ashley Grimes. When you quite a good point, Tony. When you look at the two teams side by side, you're going, I know who Jimmy Case is, but no Graham Mosey. Don't know what these other boys are like. And so there was a lot made of Steve Foster not being on the team, and obviously came back in the replay. And it's that first game was, I thought United were actually quite nervy when it got going and things got, the match started really getting into it. We went a goal behind. Gary Stevens opened the scoring for no, it wasn't. It was Gordon Smith. I beg your pardon. Gordon Smith opened the scoring. Tony, you were there. What was the feeling like in the United end? Was it disbelief? Did you think this isn't happening, or was it kind of expected? What was running through your 15-year-old mind at that point?
Like I said, as we went down there and up Wembley Way, we were very, very expectant. It was quite raucous and quite boisterous. But obviously Brighton had been relegated, and there was various jubilation amongst the United fans that City had gone down with them unexpectedly the week before as well. And then Brighton just came out, and it was so open. The first 30 minutes was so open. And Brighton, like you say, we took the lead after about 15 minutes. It didn't look a great piece of work from Gary Bailey in nets for the header. And then it was nerves on the United team not to go 2-0 down. I think we were always confident we could get an equaliser, but we really didn't want to go 2 down. And then I think that spread to the seats and the terraces. I think the United fans were for the rest of that half relatively quiet from how they'd been. It was a real, especially with the heavens opening, it was a real dampener on the atmosphere in the United end.
But it then put a real cup-tight edge to it, didn't it? With the underdogs, and Brighton were underdogs. Let's not beat around the bush here. They were definitely the underdogs for the game, and it took on that real cup-tie feel of one mistake on that wet surface could be disaster for one of the teams. And obviously it didn't quite pan out like that, but it could have been a lot worse. Steve Renfrew on Twitter said he went with his dad. It was his first final. His favourite player at the times was Ray Wilkins. And I know, Tony, Mr. Mujak, you're a huge Butch fan. When he curled it in, I nearly exploded. You weren't the only one, Dave. I was 14. His dad died just before Christmas, and he'll be thinking about him from yesterday. And he gave me my love of United. What a great gift. Chris Lepkowski, hope I've pronounced that right. The first cup final he remembers, he was supporting United as everyone wanted Brighton to win. So he assumed, this is a good one, United were the underdogs. Remembered the number 7 catching the eye. But that wasn't unusual, Chris, to be honest. Pat Stevens says, Butch's goal, Bailey's save, then falling down the stairs, cracking my head and laying on the sofa with concussion for the replay. No, we didn't laugh at that, Pat. We really didn't. Mark Kelly's, the replay was his first FA Cup final, or his first FA Cup final experience. David Clark, I watched both games on TV. It became a big deal. Now, I didn't know this because it was the third final in a row to go to a replay between 1912 and 1981. There had only been one other replay, which I never knew that. You learn something new every day. And Red Rebel says he lives 15 miles from Brighton. He's been a United fan since 77. Gary Bailey saved the whole school going to the replay except me and my mate who were United. Them getting smashed 4-0 the day after the replay was a great day at school. And lots and lots and lots of these. Paul says, Stevie Foster, what a difference you have made. Sung with relish on the terraces at the replay. I've got so many of these comments. I don't know if an hour is going to be long enough. We might need longer. But we then equalised through Frank Stapleton. The ball come to the far post and he kind of barrels it into the roof of the net. And then, for me, a goal that could have graced a World Cup final, a European Cup final, and it is in my top 3 favourite goals, FA Cup final goals of all time. Ray Wilkins. Tony, Mr. Mujek, you love Ray Wilkins, as I just touched about. Talk to me about that goal. I will never bore of seeing it. I've got to be honest.
I think what I remembered most was his celebration afterwards. It was almost like, because he never scored many goals. But funny enough, at Chelsea, he scored some screamers at Chelsea, and he had quite a good goal scoring record for a midfielder. But he was so classy. I mean, I loved Ray Wilkins. I thought he was ahead of his time. He was a player who, in the modern game, he would be a star in the modern game with the way he could control the game, his passing. He never gave the ball away. I mean, he was often criticised for ball retention, which is crazy in these days when that's what you. But he had a great right foot, a great left foot. The only thing he really lacked was pace, to be fair. He was such a tactician. He was such a good thinker of the game. And then and funny enough, he got a little bit of stick that season, but it was weird because a lot of people forget he was actually Man United and England captain before Robbo. And it was only when he was injured the following year and he fractured his skull or something that Robson took over both for United and England, and Ray couldn't get the captaincy back. But he was such a superb footballer. So when he got it and he bent the ball, it was one of those goals from our perspective. Virtually, I don't think any, maybe Murin, but very few players on our team had that kind of ability to do that kind of thing. It was just outstanding. And then he kind of went on a marathon of a run where he was just and people couldn't catch him. And you think he ran faster in the celebrations than he did with anything on the pitch. It was just sublime, but it lit up the whole game. The game was, as Tony said, was a little bit nervy for most of it. And that just lit the game up because it was a goal of pure class. And it was a shame, really, because it should have been the goal that won the cup final. It was that goal. It was. And I was delighted for him because even then he was one of my favourite players. And then obviously he had the privilege, obviously, of picking up his only trophy at United in the replay. So I was delighted for him.
Yeah, I've read that in interviews he was knackered. He knackered himself out from the just tearing off in celebration. And I've got to be honest with you, if you score a goal like that in an FA Cup final, it doesn't matter. You're not just going to walk back, are you? You are going to go on an absolute rampage of a celebration.
But I was curious to ask Tony, what was it like in the stands? Because
I was going to ask exactly the same question.
Because it's bad, and it's not bad enough. It's fantastic enough just to score a goal. But when you score a goal like that,
well, it was one of those things where when the goals go in at the other end, you kind of wish you were closer to it. But because it had such a curl on his shot from behind the other goal, we had a great view of it. You could see it bending in even better from afar than you would if you were near. So it was really, a glory and unexpected, partly because Wilkins wasn't known for his goals at United. It was really a glorious moment. Can't remember him running off so much because
you were going nuts at the same time.
And I remember him saying after that he blamed Brighton's equaliser on that run because he didn't have any puff left of him. But I thought in the 72nd minute, it was 15 minutes later or something that Brighton equalised. He should have got it back by then, but no. Like you say, the unusual 4 goals in that game because Stapleton, of course, scored and became, I think he was the first player then to score for 2 different clubs in a FA Cup final. And I still think he's the only one to score for and against United in FA Cup finals. And then Smith, of course, is missed at the end, and people often forget he scored the first one. And then the equaliser and Wilkins' great goal is often forgotten in that, especially with the goals in the 4 goals in the replay. Means a lot of people's memories, it's the goals in the replay that are often focused on. But it was a great moment. It looked like we'd come back and taken the FA Cup at that point, that we'd finally, and on the terraces as well, the United fans had refound their voice, I think, in the second half, and didn't really have to. It didn't take too long for them to equalise. I think it was about 10 minutes into the second half when Frankie equalised. And again, not too long after that, about 20 minutes when Wilkins put us ahead. So it felt like we'd come back and won 2-1 again. So the conceding the equaliser was quite a shock.
Yeah. Tony, was that Wilkins goal? Was it one of those where you're behind it and you knew it was in before it got in? You're like, this is in. Was it one of those moments where you think, is it? This is definitely going in.
Yeah, from where I was, which was slightly on the right of the big end, as soon as you knew it was curving, you knew that would, if it stayed low enough, you knew it was going in. Yeah.
I mean, poor old Graham Mosley must be sick of left-footed United players when Gordon Hill scored against him in the 77 semi-final. 76 semi-final, 77 I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And Ray Wilkins, obviously, it was a little bit more to the right, but and I said it's in my top 3 favourite FA Cup goals of all time. If you're interested, Ricky Villier's in '81 for Tottenham, the little mazy run he scored, and of course Norman's. Yeah, I'm not going to go any further than that, but yeah, so. Trevor O'Callaghan on Twitter, he was 9. It was his first time that really understood why he was following United. He loved the team, the jerseys. Robbo, my hero, still is. Yeah, you're one of many, Trevor. Crushed them in the replay. Smith must score, which we'll come to. That was the team of my childhood, and I love them. Stapleton was class. Daz Dent, listening to the game on a train via transistor radio. Hear the words, and Smith must score, just as we enter a tunnel near home. 10-year-old me sulking, presuming we'd lost. Hugh says a great goal from Butch and huge relief at the end. Dan Donnelly, the best United team ever, the one that reeled me in. Alan Folds, what a night. Saw my team lift the FA Cup, got back home about then, left school that morning. Oh, okay. Andy Dibble, both games. Wilkins' goal was brilliant. The save from Bailey at the death and that chance in the replay. Stevie Foster, what a difference you have made. Happy days. And Craig says, I won't use the explanation he's got here. Drunk on Wembley Way, let's put it that way. 4 times in 1983. Sparky complaining of price of burgers outside at £2.50, which in 1983 was an awful lot of money. Butts 500 says he jibbed in the replay wrong end and got leathered. And Steve Johnson, there's a train strike and he had to go in on the coach. So we're 2-1 up with 5 or 6 minutes left, Tony. And are you thinking we're home and dry, or are you thinking there's still a potential banana skin to be had here because Brighton were pushing forward, trying for an equaliser? Was it on the terraces? Was it expected, or was it kind of we'll just weather the storm, we'll ride this out, and then we'll go home as 2-1 winners? What happened? What was it like when you think this is not gonna end well?
Yeah, no, I thought we were a bit overconfident probably, and I didn't expect Brighton to equalise, and the sort of victory songs were just starting to get going as we got to the last few minutes. I mean, Brighton performed well that day. We sort of
did
performed better than the relegation fodder we were. So it was a shock when that went in, and I think it shocked the team as well. For me, we never really threatened in extra time. It was United had probably scored their last goal when Wilkins scored, because we just weren't expecting for Brighton to come back. You know, we'd had a pretty awful last half of the season, Brighton, other than the FA Cup. We'd been relegated quite quickly. We were one of the first teams to go down, so we really didn't expect such a robust response. Maybe that was my naivety as a 15-year-old.
Yeah, so it finishes 2-2. We go into extra time, and I could be honest, I think it kind of passed by a little bit until a couple of minutes from the very, very end, and the infamous "And Smith must score" episode. I know what I was thinking watching that, and I won't repeat it here, but Tony Parks, Mr. Mujek, Mike Robinson has kind of just sidestepped, I think it was Kevin Moran, and he's squared it to Gordon Smith, and you're thinking, what are you thinking?
Well, what was really interesting, and it's the difference between going to a match live and watching it on TV live, is that the drama's worse because you've got the commentary team, building that kind of drama as well. So once they'd equalised, I never forget John Motson just talking all the time about this is going to be Brighton's day. This is going to be Brighton's day. And so he was putting it in our minds as United supporters watching it on TV that it was also going to. So now we were nervous because of the drama built up by the television commentary. And that obviously is what makes John Motson, or did make John Motson, such a great commentator. He was able to, get you to emote, if you like. But I agree with you, Paul. I think extra time flew us by, but a couple of things had happened that made me much more nervous. One was we'd lost late in the game against Liverpool in the League Cup final, which I mentioned a little while ago. So that was at the back. That was playing at the back of our mind. We'd lost that momentum that Tony was just talking about, and I'm thinking, here we go again. Here we, in March, we were all over Liverpool in the first half. We'd lost it. They came back and scored twice, and we lost the game. It's going to happen again. And then the other thing that was, and again, you may remember it, I was also thinking, I don't want this to be Arsenal 79 all over again, where, we lost in the last minute of the game. So we had a kind of history in our last two Wembley finals of, not performing well in the closing stages, of letting Wembley nerves take over. So to say that I was chewing, fingernails and there was nerves going around. I remember my father saying to me, for God's sake, sit down, because I was pacing. I don't know if that's something everybody does at home, but I get into this habit of when I'm nervous, I have to stand up. I can't sit down, and I start to pace. And he's a very calm person, so he was like telling me to sit, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, so he's telling me sit down, because I'm walking around the living room, and I couldn't wait for extra time to be over. And when Smith got the chance to put my head in the hands, and I can't remember the shot because I didn't look.
And Tony from the terraces, I don't even know what you were thinking at that point. Was you thinking this is a nightmare? We're just going to go home and going, we've really just been beaten by the team that's been relegated? Was that thought there, or was it?
Well, Smith had so much time. You could actually process the impending doom of defeat before he'd struck it. I think it was a 2-on-1. It was played quite slowly across to Smith, and he still had time to touch it. And you just knew he only really had to slot it in. And I don't even think Gary Bailey was particularly quick to come out to sort of block it, to sort of land on it, if you like. But I think once Bailey saw Smith hesitate ever so slightly at that top level, he gave himself a chance and just flung himself at it, and the cheer was immense. But yeah, I thought it was in. It looked like he just had to slot it in. He possibly didn't even need the first touch, but once he had the first touch, he had time to just put it into the corner. The relief was immense there. But I did have time to process, we're going to lose this now.
Yeah, I think that was probably the case for most on the terraces and those watching from home. I think, people talk about the miss itself. Gary Bailey don't think gets a huge amount of credit for it's actually a very good save. He was a bit slow getting down. But when he got down to it, it was actually a tremendous save. And we've seen the likes of the Schmeichels over the years and the De Gea's do these kind of saves. But I just thought, it was a bad miss, and I'm sure that Gordon Smith gets reminded of that every time he talks football about something. But I think equally it was a tremendous save from Gary Bailey. So I've got to go through some Facebook comments as well, because they're absolutely blinding. Stephen Spencer was there for both matches, had a bit of a tumble in a curry house in St Albans the night before the first game. Steve Foster, what a difference you have made from the replay, stands out. John Evans couldn't get tickets for the first game. He got one for the replay. Stevie Foster, what a difference you have made. Stayed in London. He ended up in Soho for the night. Angela Blaney on Facebook was there, flew over for the game, but had to come back, so missed the replay. Still had a fab time though. Mike Styles was there for the replay. Stevie Foster, what a difference you have made. That's a common repeating theme. Tommy Miller, I was there that day with just enough money to stay over somewhere for the night. We realised after the draw that we would have had to return in the week for the replay, which meant funds would be short. Dave Hillfunk Sheether on Facebook. This is brilliant. He wore a kilt and a sporran and a Dennis Law shirt to the first game. Crazy days on the booze. A big day out in those days. Replay toned down, but still on the booze. George Patterson was there behind the goal. Ray Wilkins scored a screamer and the save at the end saved us. Noreen Gill, she was there with her late husband for the both games. On the way down to the first one, we stopped at a pub in Woodstock, which was a bit off the beaten track. Can't remember the name of the pub. They put breakfast on for all of us on the coach, and the weather wasn't, probably what the weather was like as well. It wasn't very good. Sue Jones was there for both games. Wow, what a game, and was almost taken from us with Gordon Smith. Exceptional save from Gary Bailey. Roll on Thursday, armed with my bowler hat that she had for both matches with Rollerball Robbo on. I think that's a bit of a nod to Rollerball Rocco, the wrestler from back in the day, the old world of sport. United will brighten the night. Apparently that was what she had on a top hat. How true, what a game, what a player, what a captain. And Mark Birkin got nicked before kickoff. And when I pressed him a little bit, he said allegedly threatening a load of Brighton fans by shaking a can of beer and opening it towards them.
Yeah.
Honestly, some of these stories are unbelievable. But before we get on to the replay, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about Alan Davis. He was man of the match in the first game, and I'm going to put my hands up and say I didn't really know that much about him. I know there was a photo sort of taken before the game between himself, Ashley Grimes, and Laurie Cunningham about who was going to get the number 11 shirt. Cunningham, I think, was injured. Ashley Grimes made the bench, but Alan Davis took it. And I don't think he gets enough airtime, does Alan Davis. And I just thought he was absolutely superb in the first game. He looked like he'd been playing for United in the first team for years, just very composed. I think he set up one of the goals in the replay, if my memory serves me right. Could be wrong.
Set up two in the replay.
Sorry?
Set up two in the replay.
He set up two of them, yeah, okay. So Tony, Mr. Mujak, Alan Davis, what do you remember about his performance on that day? And
well, one of the interesting
really
things,
composed, just really composed, and for playing the midfield alongside Wilkins, Robbo, and Arnold Muren.
Well, what was interesting was Alan was a central midfielder and Manchester schoolboy. He had come through the youth system with Mike Duxbury, but because of the likes of Wilkins and Robson, never really, and those two between them didn't really get injured very often. And then Whiteside and Hughes were just behind him. And he was also in the same team as Andy Ritchie, which obviously people remember. So, and he was very well thought of. He was very high caliber, but he was just surrounded in that midfield position by some very good players. And when he was a touch younger, he didn't have the physicality that was required to push his way into the first team. It was particularly a central midfield. And he didn't have the speed to be what we called an orthodox winger. So you had Koppel on one side, you had Mickey Thomas for a while on the other side. He didn't have that kind of wing play that you would expect. He was more considered as a player, but he was very, very well thought of. I remember talking to his family when I was putting the youth book together, and they were saying he was offered so many terms by other clubs. They wanted him, but he was a United fan and he wanted to stay at United. And then when obviously, as you quite rightly said, Paul, when Koppel was injured and then Cunningham and Grimes were kind of in contention for that shirt, and then Laurie was injured, it was probably between Grimes and Alan Davies. But Alan Davies had scored quite a few important goals for the reserves. And I don't know. I mean, I still don't know to this day. It's probably a question that I would love to ask Ron Atkinson. What made him choose Alan Davies over Ashley Grimes? Because that's really the decision he had to take with Ashley Grimes getting the bench. Because what would have been more logical with Ashley Grimes's experience would put Ashley Grimes on the left wing or on the right wing, whatever, and give Alan Davies the bench. So it was really interesting why Atkinson did what he did. But for those at the club, they knew they had a very, very good player. And I don't know if you remember a season or so later when he played against Juventus in the Cup Winners' Cup, he was man of the match in that game as well. He was a very good player. Unfortunately, he got injured and so on, and we know what happened since then. But he was he was just a late bloomer, Paul. He was one of those players. He was slight, very technically gifted, but he didn't have the physicality. He was more immune. I always felt that he could take over from Murin as opposed to taking over from Robson or Wilkins, if that makes sense. He was kind of a Murin type of player. But for most people, they never knew who he was because the average person, never watched the reserves. You didn't get reserves on there was no MUTV, so you never watched the reserves play. The only way you would have known anything about him is if you went to a reserve game at Old Trafford, Central League game, and watched him week in, week out. That was the only way you got to know about these youngsters coming through.
Yeah, I know when I've had exchanges with Norman Whiteside on social media, he speaks very, very highly of Alan Davies and his ability. He was fantastic. He's just, I guess for those that, and again, I've admitted that I didn't really know who he was, and it was like, oh, okay, but what can I say? His performance on the day kind of just put it in a nutshell for it. I mean, Tony, when you was on the terraces, did you have prior knowledge of Alan Davies? If you did, or if you didn't, was it a bit of a surprise? Did you think that Ashley Grimes might have got that shirt on for that game? And I suppose in hindsight, we're quite glad he didn't. No disrespect, but Davies just had a phenomenal couple of games.
Yeah, he was great over both games and very penetrative on the second game. I feel. I always thought at the time as it was getting towards, it was a bit like Arthur Albiston coming into the 77 team late on as a youngster and being given quite a major task to fulfil. So it was quite surprising that Davies got the nod, especially with Ron Atkins, because he wasn't known really for playing too many youngsters. He brought Whiteside and Hughes into the first team. Of course, but other than that, he wasn't really known for blooding youngsters. So for Davies to get the nod over Grimes once at Cunningham, you imagine would have been Atkinson's first choice of that role had he been fit, was a great show of faith in him, and probably showed just how well he'd been doing in reserve games and in training around the first team squad in the games leading up to the final. And we had plenty of those games from April to sort of mid-May. We had a lot of games, a lot of league games. I think we had 6 games in 15 days. And I imagine Atkinson had a good look at the options in that fortnight or so before the final.
Yeah, what could have been? Like you say, Tony, he got injured, and obviously we're not going to go down the route of what happened, but just immortalised forever, I think, Alan Davies as a massive part of the success that United had in that FA Cup final in both matches. And get man of the match in both games is not a mistake. You clearly look at some of the players around him. We've mentioned those. That's no mean feat. So I just wanted to give him a bit of airtime because I think it's important that we do acknowledge the players like Alan Davies who had such a massive impact in that game. Graham Smith on Facebook was there for the first game with his dad, and it rained all day. Yes, it did. Brighton arrived by helicopter. He was right along the line when Ray curled in that fantastic goal and watched in fear, which we've spoken about, as Gordon Smith took aim in the dying seconds. Thank God for Gary Bailey. Trev Ward, I was at both games, particularly enjoyed Butch's goal and the difference Steve Foster made in the replay. There's a real theme running through this, you can tell. Ronnie Norman, Ray Wilkins' superb goal, sat in line with 6-yard box when Bailey saved from Smith. Remember having to walk away from Soho to get a drink due to some pubs refusing to let United fans in. David Watkins went to the replay. Three of us soldiers travelled from Germany to meet one of our mates who was at the final and got us tickets for the replay. We had to be back for duty the next day. Long 2 days, but well worth it. Let's get on to the replay. A little bit more straightforward and probably as was expected, I think. I think once Robbo scored that opening goal, was the result ever in doubt? Tony, Mr. Mujak.
Well, I think what was interesting was Jimmy Case kind of, him and Grealish bossed the midfield in the first game when they were talking about it. And I remember watching the replays, because I used to, get them on the old cassettes years and years ago. And you used to watch them back and you'd say, what was going on? And Grealish and Case kind of dominated. And I think if you look at the replay, Atkinson did something slightly different in the setup. Even though we normally played 4-4-2, he almost went to a 4-3-3. But what he did was he made, if you look at the replay, if you ever watch the game properly, and it's easy in hindsight. You're only young at the time, but knowing what we now know about tactics and all the rest of it, what he did was he played Robson in a much more forward role than he had in the first game, and he made Ray Wilkins sit a little bit more, in a classic, what we would call a classic 6 now. So what happened was and Murin dropped a little bit, so he kind of just boxed the midfield a little bit differently. And then what he said, I don't know what he said, but what happened was you then had Robson versus Case. And as soon as Robson, in the first, I think 5 or 10 minutes, Robson bossed Case. He won 2 or 3 really big tackles. I mean, pretty ferocious tackles. And then all of a sudden you could see you just felt, I mean, there was a feeling that it was going to be our night anyway, because Brighton had their chance, and, we felt, right, now we're going to get it done. Our class would show. There was a feeling of that, certainly from my perspective. And then when Robson won those first few tackles, it gave you even more confidence, because when he was on his game, he was really on his game. And I thought he had a little bit more freedom. And when you look back, is because Atkinson just dropped Murin a little bit defensively and made Ray play in front of the back four a little bit more to control things, which meant Ray didn't have to do as much running as well. And all of a sudden, Robson, it became the Brian Robson show as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
And he started spraying passes around. He started tackling people. And all of a sudden, Case was out of the game and Grealish was on his own. And Grealish was a good little player, but he wasn't in the class of the others. And I think that changed the whole momentum in the game. Those first 10 or 15 minutes before we scored, we were well on top. And Robson was just Mr. Colossus. And he was just prancing about doing what Brian Robson does well. And I just felt, and that just gave me huge confidence. Before we even scored, I just felt we're going to be okay.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on when he took the game by the scruff of the neck in typical Robbo style. And, I think once that first goal went in, I'll never forget John Motson's commentary. I think that's the goal that Manchester United wanted from their captain. Yeah. Tony, was that on the terraces as well? Did you have that? Did it have a different feel about it, or was there are we going to be in a similar position, or was there a feeling of this is going to be it now? Was there a confidence on the terrace, or was it still edgy and nervy? How did it feel at the time?
Apprehension there after Brian had played so well earlier. I think the older Reds thought United would steamroller it, and they were proved correct in the end. But there's still some apprehension from people who weren't quite so confident. But as Tony said, once we got going on that game, we never really looked back. The goals started to roll in quite quickly as well. And there was fewer neutrals there, I felt, on Thursday. So it was a bigger bank of United fans at one end. I'm not sure if it was more United fans in the ground as such, but there was certainly a bigger bank. And it just felt like it was going to be a night of celebration quite quickly, and that Brighton had very little answer to what was going on the pitch.
Certainly those early goals quietened their crowd.
Oh, for sure. And I've had quite a lot of comments as well about it was Sir Matt Busby's birthday, and there's lots of cheering, chanting of happy birthday, Sir Matt, at that particular time as well. We obviously, I think we made it a bit safer about 5 minutes later. When Alan Davis, who did the little touchback for Robbo to drive it past Graham Mosley into the net, and then he latched onto got the ball over, and Norman glancing header that actually at that point, or as of 2019, that made him as 18-year-old the youngest player to ever score an FA Cup final. Was that second goal crucial to the whole flow of the match at that point? Did you feel at 1-0 it was still a little bit we could give up here, or was it at 2-0? Yeah, we're home and dry. Tony, Mr. Jack, how did you see that? How important was it to get that second goal so quickly after the first?
Do you know, it's a good question, because I haven't really thought of it in that way. I just felt that once we got the first, we were dominant still. We were cocky. There was a cockiness about our play that night that was definitely lacking in the first game. And it reminded me of the first half against Liverpool in the League Cup final. We were very strong against them in that league. It was almost like we got our little bit of confidence back that we'd lacked for a few weeks, whatever it was. And we were knocking the ball around really well. And it was like a second was just going to come. I can't remember. I'd have to look back at the tape, but I can't remember Gary Bailey making many saves. I think from memory, he might have touched one over the bar, like a long range shot from Smiley from memory. He touched over the bar, halfway through the second half or something. But I don't think they really threatened Gary Bailey at all. I don't remember any save he made. I thought once we scored the first, their hearts sunk as if to say, they'd lost their opportunity. And as you say, and then Norman scored and it was all over at 2-0.
Yeah. Tony, was that the feeling from where you were standing in Wembley as well? It was important to get a second goal as quickly as we did after the first one to settle the nerves. And did you feel at 1-0 it was still a little bit anyone's game?
Oh, I think at 1-0, especially after the first game, I think, Brighton, we weren't counting Brighton out, but the second one came reasonably quickly. And then it became a little bit like the exhibition we were expecting on the Saturday, probably arrogantly expecting on the Saturday, and really played them off the pitch in that first half especially. Second half was a bit more sedate, but I don't think Brighton had much answer to what we were doing in that first half. I think their season had been run by that point, and certainly at 2-0 down, it would have been an almighty shock if Brighton had offered anything after that. We were really dominant, especially in midfield. Nothing was coming through as well. They weren't getting, as Tony said, they weren't making chances at the other end. We were as firm a grasp as you could want in the first half of the cup final replay.
Yeah, I'll tell you something we didn't quite touch on a little bit earlier was Arnold Muren's pass to Ray Wilkins for that goal in the first game. Just looked like he a big tackle from, I think, Norman Whiteside, and he picked it up and just into on a play. And I meant to mention that about how good that pass was as well. At 2-0, the wind has knocked out of Brighton sails. Did you ever think it was going to get to 4? Did you think it could have been more, should have been more? Or do you think United, once they scored their third with, I think, Gordon McQueen flicking it on to the far post and then Robbo just bundling it into the back of the net, at 3-0 at half-time, did you think that this is going to be a cricket score? Or do you think 3-0 is going to play the 45 minutes out? Where did you think that was going to go? Where did you think United were going to go? That's to Tony, Mr. Mujak.
Well, again, I think it's different on watching it on television than on the terraces, because what's happening is John Motson's throwing statistics at you. So he's suddenly saying, it's been so many years since there's been 4 goals. There's been so many years since there's been 5 goals. So now even the commentators are saying United have won it, and it's just a matter of by how many. So when and it was completely different. The commentary was so different from the first game to the second game. It was almost like, yeah, well done, Brighton. You've had your moment in time. You've held your heads up high, but you've just come up against a different class of team tonight. And now let's talk about United. And all the talk then on the television was, Robson and how well we controlled the game. And then it was really talking about, how many we were going to score. And then of course we get the penalty, which was, I can't remember exactly, but it was maybe just, it wasn't right near the end, but it was probably halfway through the second half we got the penalty. And we were all hoping Robson was going to get it for his hat trick, to be the only player to score a hat trick in the final. And he gives it to Murin because he's the penalty taker. And of course, the commentary's going on about this. And it was almost like Robson was controlling everything. You know what I mean? Just by doing that, Robson was even in control, if that makes sense, Paul. You know, he was dictating the tempo of the game. He was dictating the action of the game. He was dictating the leadership of the game. He was just dictating everything at that point. Even when people were saying to him, you take it, he went, no, I'm not the penalty taker. Murin's the penalty taker. Arnold's taking it. You know, and it was just this huge confidence that Robbo was giving around that ground at that time that, you know, anything could have happened in terms of score. But it was just over by half time. It really was. And as Tony said, we just took our foot off the gas in the second half and just controlled it.
Yeah, I mean, I think wasn't it Robbo got bundled over for the penalty.
Yeah.
And you know, I guess every man and his dog, Tony on the terraces, screaming for Robbo to take it to get an FA Cup final hat trick. But it turns out in later years that it was already pre-agreed that any penalties Arnold Murin would take them. And you know, Robbo did his captain bit and gave him that. Did you feel the same on when you were watching it, from the Wembley terraces, Tony? That it was the second half kind of just limped across. Not it limped over the line, but it you know, the intensity was taken off because we were 3-0 up, and then we get the penalty. Was it? Did you have that kind of feeling watching that?
Yeah, I think it was very celebratory, and I think on the pitch it'd be Brighton had accepted defeat and didn't want the thrashing, and United were accepting the trophy without having to hand out the thrashing. I think it was a bit like sparring in many ways. I remember being really upset that Robson didn't get to take the penalty. He was my favourite player. And for him to get an FA Cup final hat-trick would have been unbelievable. And I'm really unhappy. That was the only downside of the entire day, that was that Murin got to take, and fair play to him, dispatch the penalty. I think he was the first European player, wasn't he? First non-UK and non-Irish player to score in a cup final as well. So you know, he deserved a goal. He was a great player, but I was really disappointed with that. And then there was all the stuff with it being Sir Matt Busby's birthday, singing "Happy Birthday" to Sir Matt from the end, and you couldn't see him. Obviously, you couldn't pick him out from where the United fans were, but when he raised his hat, then you could see his hat going, his pale hat in the sky, and of course that brought the house down as well. So it was a great second half of celebration and singing, and you know, possibly a bit more sporting to win it just 4-0 rather than try and just you know, rub Brighton's nose in the dirt.
Yeah, and Arnold Murin's little hair flick just before he takes that. That's been pointed out many times. Is if you don't notice, slow it down, you'll see him just kind of flick his hair to one side. But it was a beautiful penalty. It was just stroked it into the net, didn't he? And at 4-0, yeah. Did you want to go, oh, let's get 5 and let's get 6? But I think United took pity on them in the end. So Paddy Reardon, who's on Facebook, he was there. It was the replay. His mate Chop had chicken pox. Damien Crowther, great day out, heart in mouth in the last minute, according to the first game. Thursday was easy. Happy birthday, Sir Matt. Ginner Stockport went to both games, the good old days. Lots of good old days, comments, happy days. Queuing up overnight, waiting for ticket office to open on a Sunday morning and getting on Dave Smith, who's supporters club coaches. Kelvin Dilly was there for both games, £5 entry both times. Guys on the turnstiles became rich as it seemed that no one had any tickets. Stu McGeorge singing Billy Bunter to a fat Brighton fan and singing Stevie Foster, "What a difference you have made." There was a big thing in the media about Steve Foster being the saving grace, and he was a great defender. It just didn't make an iota of difference when United clicked into gear and those games. So it was, I guess, United fans were thoroughly enjoying that moment of singing Stevie Foster, "What a difference you have made."
Well, yeah. I think what also happened was, if you look at the second goal, Whiteside left him on his knees and just caught him cold in terms of going in front of him from Alan Davies' cross. And he made him look foolish because in actual fact, Steve Gatting played centre-half in the first game and kept Norman under control for a large part of the game because Ramsey was the fullback and he was injured for the second game. So Gatting got moved to fullback. And I think that's what, you know, Whiteside had more of an influence in the second game with his physicality. because Foster in the paper was saying he relished the physicality. Well, you don't say that to Norman Whiteside.
No, you don't. You do not say that to Norman at all. No.
He's only 17 or 18, and you're saying to him, "I'm going to, I'm not going to let you get away with it," because they were upset that Norman had hurt Chris Ramsey in the first game.
Which is why he never played in the second game. Yeah,
so I remember looking at the newspapers afterwards, and Foster was saying that not exactly retribution, but now he's back in the team. Whiteside won't be pushing his weight around as much, and then I remember him getting left on the floor. And that's when the chant started coming out. Foster, what a difference you've made, because you didn't bully Whiteside at all.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody got to bully Norman around, to be fair.
Really?
I remember Derek Wallace in the Daily Mirror the next day described the chant as cruel and unnecessary.
Football crowds for you, though, right? it's all about that. It's all banter these days, I think, isn't it? Yeah, but Brian Beaumont on Twitter, going to Malta 2 days after watching the replay in a United bar, first time realising what a huge fan base that they had in Malta, and it's massive out there. Dave D73, for the first game he was on holiday in Portugal, very nice too. The replay, we were back home, and I remember jumping on my dad's back and getting the piggyback off him round the front room when the final whistle went. Was only 9. Adam Daber, remember both games, but what sticks in his mind most is the coach driver on the return from the replay took a wrong turn and coming back to Manchester via Sheffield, getting home at 5 o'clock in the morning. Very good spirits on the coach despite this. Tony Walsh says, lucky in the first game, Smith must score. Thank God he didn't. Jimmy Case kicking everything that moved. Thank God for Robbo and the 4-0. And of course, Robbo went up to receive the trophy, the first of 3 that he would pick up as United captain. Just a brilliant day, just a brilliant replay, and winning the FA Cup. After the disappointment 4 years earlier, and you look at it, we were in finals in 76, 77, 79, 83 and 85. So we were a damn fine cup side back in the day. It just never quite translated into league performances. But as we've all touched on, the FA Cup had just something magical about it that was, if you're going to win a trophy, that's the one you wanted to win. Guys, do you know what? Honestly, I could chat for hours about that final and talking about the comments and the experiences. I really appreciate both of you coming on this evening's podcast. Apologies for the fraught nature of it, which I won't go into right now, but we finally got there. So Tony Davies, who was 15 years old and on the terraces of both games at the final, you can find him on Twitter at TonyRD66. And Tony Clark is at Mr. Mujek. Find him on Twitter there. Gentlemen, thank you so much indeed for your time this evening, and maybe we'll see you on a future podcast as we talk all United before Fergie.
Can I leave you with one stat as we sign off?
Of course you can. Absolutely you can.
With our result yesterday, we've become the only team to reach an FA Cup final of every decade since the Second World War. So we talk about the FA Cup being in our blood and in our history. Well, it certainly is.
Absolutely. And Tony Davies, pretty much, thank you very much indeed for you coming on as well. It's been fascinating hearing your experiences as a teenager on the terraces at both of those games. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences.
No problem. I've really enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
No worries at all. Thank you, guys. So this has been episode 3 of the UBF podcast, United Fergie podcast. Hope you've enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening back on the audio podcast, please be sure to leave a review. And we'll be back next Monday. I'd say 8:30 now, but I shall tongue firmly in my cheek there. But 8:30 next Monday, we'll be back with another United Before Fergie podcast. Until then, have a great week, and we'll see you then. Good night, everyone.
Good night.